So another major YouTuber posted a video on acoustics, and when I first saw it, I thought, oh no, it's going to be another video full of misinformation and bad conclusions, and you know what? I was pleasantly surprised because it actually turned out to be a pretty accurate video with a lot of good information. But I still wanted to make this video. I'm going to go over some of the things they talk about in this video, give you a bit more detail and clarification. And also, I want to talk about the product that this video is about because this product has been getting a lot of attention lately, and I've even got some questions in my comments about it, but I really have some opinions on it. So we'll get to those, but I wanted to use this video as a way to tackle talking about that product. So anyway, let's dive in and look at this video by LinusTechTips about the Elgato Wave Panels.
Every time we shoot a video in our new workshop, we run up against the same problem. Every time I talk, you can hear an echo.
So technically it's not echo, it's reverb. The distinction is very subtle, but generally echo is a very long time with a very defined return. So like yelling into a canyon, the sound going back and forth between the canyon walls provides a very clear and defined kind of return of the sound to you. Reverb is more kind of diffused, where rather than a single defined reflection of the sound returning to you, it's a lot of different reflections coming back together that gives kind of this smooth tail. So realistically, if you were to use either term, they're pretty much interchangeable, but a lot of acousticians, of course, will correct you if you use the wrong term.
Okay, it's not quite an echo. What it actually is reverb, and it's caused by a standing sound wave that is bouncing back and forth inside the room.
Okay, I should have waited 5 more seconds because he did clarify, but now you know a bit more about the difference between reverb and echo. Calling it a standing wave is not totally accurate. A standing wave has a very specific meaning in acoustics, and it refers to a sound wave that is resonating within a room. So calling it a standing wave isn't really accurate, but he's right that it's the sound bouncing around within a room, and as that sound kind of slowly fades out and the energy is slowly lost, you get this smooth decay tail. That's reverb.
Now, it is something that you can address in post, but as you guys can hear right now, sometimes the solution is worse than the problem. Unless, of course, you go right to the source.
So again, that's accurate. There are tools that remove reverb, but they don't do a very good job because computers aren't very good at distinguishing between different things, if that makes sense. Our brain has an entire section that's dedicated to taking sound waves and evaluating what they are. Computers aren't particularly good at that, and so it's hard for them to decide what's the actual thing we want to hear and what's the reverb that we want to get rid of. So that's a good example of what excessive de-reverb processing sounds like. You can hear it. Actually, my last video has a bit of it because I didn't have all the acoustic treatment up in my room. But even on like major TV shows and that sort of thing, sometimes you can hear it. It's not ideal, but sometimes it is the best solution. But yes, if you can address the source issue, which is the reverb in the room, and actually get rid of the reverb in the recording rather than trying to do it in post, that is much better.
We, with the help of Elgato, are going to be deploying a literal mountain of their wave panels. These are mostly designed for streamers, but the thing is, if you've got a good, high-quality acoustic panel, ready, Nicholas? Yep. You can use it for pretty much anything. So we're going to go one stage at a time with each of.
So that's true. An acoustic panel is an acoustic panel. It's got a fairly short list of properties. That is the absorption coefficient, so how much sound it absorbs at different frequencies. And that's about it. In other videos, I've talked about the importance of things like fire ratings and that sort of thing. But when it comes to acoustics, really all you need to worry about is the absorption coefficient, at least when it comes to porous absorbers like foam panels.
Each of these boxes costing about $100 US, and see, do they do anything? And if they do anything, how much do you need before you get some kind of measurable impact?
So one thing I want to address right away is that I do want to talk about these panels, and what I want to say about them is I don't recommend them. Not because there's inherently any issues with them, and we'll get more into some of the claims that Elgato makes later on, but fundamentally, what Linus is saying is, how much of this panel do you need? Well, for most acoustic panels, you can figure that out really easily. So I did a video on MKBHD's studio talking, he briefly mentioned the acoustics of his studio in one of the videos he did. And one of the things I talked about was the BBC acoustic handbook. I don't remember the exact name, but I'll link it in the description. But among other things, it has a chart that shows you the ideal reverberation time of a room based on the volume of the room and the what you want to use it for. So, for example, if you want to use it for speaking content, you would want a lower reverberation time. Something like pop music, you might want like a moderate reverberation time, and something like classical or jazz, you'd want a longer reverberation time. So, if you have kind of an ideal target reverberation time, there are calculators online that let you put in the dimensions of your room, and you can figure out exactly how much absorptive material you need to get into that target range. The problem with these Elgato Wave panels is that they don't have any published absorption coefficients. You need to know the absorption coefficient to know how much material you need. And Elgato doesn't, as far as I can tell, have that data published anywhere on their material. So just a really quick and dirty follow-up from editing. I looked and dug a little bit more, and I was actually able to find acoustic measurements on this panel. And Elgato actually did a really good job of describing the measurements, what they mean, and it's actually pretty useful. However, it is buried in a help section, and there's no direct link to that information from the panel's product page. So the absorption coefficient information is out there. You can go find it and use it, and I would recommend doing so. However, it is fairly buried and you do have to find it, but because most of this video I did kind of go out of my way to criticize Elgato for not publishing this information. They did publish it, they just kind of hid it, so I'll link it in the description. And based on that, despite what I say in the rest of this video, I would recommend the panels. Look at the absorption coefficients and use that to figure out how many panels you need, and that will save you a lot of time. But based on that, I would actually recommend these panels. I will say, as far as their overall performance, they're not as good as, say, RLX panels. Most RLX panels are closer to 100% or even higher than 100% absorption, which is possible because the calculations don't take into account the edges of the panel. It's complicated, but real proper panels are generally 10% or so better than these panels, but these panels are pretty good and they're definitely reasonable. And as you saw in the rest of the video, diminishing returns, that extra 10% doesn't make a massive difference. So I'd recommend them. Look at the absorption coefficients, look at what you need, and feel free to buy them, despite what I say in the rest of the video. It is not easy to test acoustic materials effectively and reliably, not unless you happen to have a 6-figure anechoic chamber in your basement. So for that reason, most reputable acoustic manufacturers measure that data or measure their materials for you in an expensive acoustic anechoic chamber, and they publish that data for you so that you can make an informed purchasing decision. So that's really my biggest gripe with the Elgato panels, not necessarily that they don't work, because I'm sure they do, and we'll see in this video that they do. But, a reputable acoustic material manufacturer should absolutely publish data on their products so that you as a consumer can make an informed decision.
Before we can mount anything though, we need to get a baseline reading of the current state of the room. In order to science it up a little bit, we're gonna switch over to this puppy right here. This is the UMIC 1, an omnidirectional condenser microphone from Mini DSP that is specifically designed for taking room measurements like this. The software we're gonna use is called REW or REW. We just click measure.
I've heard a lot of this software, a lot of people talking about the software. I've never heard it called REW. It's Room EQ Wizard. It's probably the most standard way of testing acoustic environments. To be clear, it's not, the highest end, most advanced professional software, but it's also free, and it's by far the best free tool out there. So
rename it to control, no panels, and start. You guys are gonna wanna plug your ears.
So what he said there about plugging your ears is very true. When you're doing tests like this, you want it to be very loud because you want your test signal to be significantly louder than the ambient noise floor, because the ambient noise floor can mess with your readings. What he's doing here is taking an impulse response measurement. I have a whole video that talks about impulse response for a different purpose, but the same fundamental concept is exactly the same. And he's doing it with this speaker, which is designed to radiate sound in all directions. Now, for doing this kind of test, generally, I wouldn't put the speaker right there. Generally, the reason is that as you move around the room, the sound characteristics change somewhat. And that's because certain frequencies, especially lower ones, will resonate. And that creates standing waves like we talked about earlier. So that means the frequency response and the sound of the room will change as you move around the room. So in order to effectively capture all of those different room modes and stuff, you need to set your speaker and your microphone somewhere where all of those room modes are going to be present so that you're equally exciting all of the room modes. Now that can be either the dead center of the room, but of course it's pretty hard to find the exact dead center of the room. So a much easier way to do it is to do it in the corners, because in every corner where all three of the room's dimensions meet, that is also a location where all of the base modes, all the room modes in the room are equally present. So generally, for doing the sweep, I would put the speaker in one of the corners of the room, because that way I'm getting a full picture of all of the different room modes and such that are present in the room.
Wow, it's no wonder the audio is so bad in here, even with all the stuff that we have in the room now. I mean, it was worse before. We are still seeing standing waves that are lasting as long as about...
So again, that's not a standing wave, that's just the decay time. Yeah, a standing wave is a resonant wave in a room. It is different. He's talking about the decay time. Yeah. Also, you'll see he's measuring the T30 here. This is just interesting to point out. So RT60, which you can see at the top, is the time it takes for the reverberation to decay by 60 decibels. It's the standard way to measure reverberation time. However, most of the time you cannot get a true RT60. The reason is that you're going to deal with too much background noise. So let's say you have 30 decibels of background noise, which is a pretty quiet room. You would need to have your test tone over 90 decibels to be able to get a clean RT60 measurement over a full 60 decibel drop. So because that's not very practical except in very specialized situations, there are different measurements. So in this case, he has T30 selected. So 30 is basically measuring a 30 decibel drop, and then it's just extrapolating the rest of it, because in a normal, generally cube-shaped room, the decay will be linear, so you can measure a smaller snippet and just kind of extrapolate what the RT60 is. There's also another measurement called T20 that does it over a smaller amount of time. The longer time is generally more reliable. However, you still have to be, that level over the noise floor. You'll also see that he has smoothed this to 1/3 octave bands. If you look over on the left-hand side, you'll see this really, really zigzaggy shape. That's the actual measured shape. But that doesn't really reflect what we hear. So generally, you want to smooth that to either a 1/6 or 1/3 octave band. That smooths the line and it better reflects what we actually hear. So instead of being obsessed with all these massive bumps and dips, you get an actual overall picture that shows kind of how we perceive the frequency response.
0.9 of a second. That's hard to listen to. Now, the goal isn't to turn this place into an anechoic chamber. Elgato Wave Panels would not be the way to do that. We just want to cut down on reverb. So the first thing we need to know is how much actual wall and ceiling area there is in this room. Why don't we target 5% coverage and see what happens?
So he's, again, absolutely right. I talked about this earlier. You want to determine the surface area in your room and then use that as a way to get the ideal reverberation time. Actually, you get the ideal reverberation time based on the volume, and then you would use surface area coverage to figure out how to get to your ideal reverberation time. Again, there's calculators online that make this all stupid easy. But if you don't have the absorption coefficient of your acoustic materials, then you're just guessing, like Linus is, which, isn't bad, but personally, I'd rather just be able to know how much material I need and not have to buy a bunch of panels and put them up and measure. It's a lot easier if you can figure it out in advance and you need material where you know the absorption coefficient.
Problem. My control, I said it was with no panels in the room. I had these ones sitting here. So nobody touched these. I want to keep this scientific, boys. So these are off limits. This pack though, this wasn't in here. James, whoop.
This is one reason why I like this video, because unlike a lot of other YouTubers, Linus is actually taking a very scientific, measured approach. It's not perfect, obviously, but again, I would probably recommend this video to someone if they wanted to learn how to acoustically treat their room, because it is pretty accurate, certainly accurate enough for the average user.
Full disclosure, the reason we have that omnidirectional speaker and the reason we already know how to use this software is because it is our intention to make our own acoustic panel product. But that doesn't mean that I'm gonna say this is anything but, damn, looking pretty good.
Okay, Linus, you probably won't watch this video, but if you do, if you make your own acoustic panels, please go through the effort to have them laboratory tested and publish the data, because if you want to be serious about producing acoustic products, that is the way to go about it.
So these aren't the thickest acoustic panels in the world. That causes me some concern. The thinner they are, the lower the band of frequencies they will absorb. It's thinner meaning higher frequencies only.
He kind of got it reversed there, but yes, generally thinner material will only absorb at higher frequencies. If you want to absorb lower frequencies, you need thicker material.
But it is two different materials. That's cool because you've got a low density foam here and a higher density foam here. And plus, anytime that sound goes through a medium change, that's pretty good for absorption.
So that's true. It is true that denser material will absorb at lower frequencies, generally at the cost of higher frequency absorption. Less dense material will absorb better at higher frequencies, but you need a lot more of it to absorb at lower frequencies. So the theory here is sound. The theory is two different densities of material for absorbing two different frequency ranges of sound, but of course that's only the theory and we have no idea if it actually works because Elgato has not published any data on these panels. It is true anytime sound goes through a medium change, that's good for absorption. The reason is refraction. If you've ever, stuck a straw in a glass cup and it looks like the straw bends, that's because light is refracting, because light travels at a different speed through water versus air. The exact same thing is true for sound. When sound enters a physical object, it travels at a different speed, and that causes refraction. That causes the sound wave to bend. So when you go through multiple different layers of material, you're refracting multiple times, and you're basically increasing the distance that sound has to travel through the material, which in turn is increasing the amount of absorption. So yes, it's true, having multiple layers can give you an advantage, but again, that's only theoretical, and you have to actually measure the panel in an anechoic environment to actually see if your theory holds up and it actually works.
Now, what are you thinking in terms of placement? Do we want to put individual panels just kind of around? Do we want to clip them together in kind of geometric shapes and go for large flat surfaces? Are we targeting the walls, the corners?
I think that you want to have big contiguous patches where possible. Like look between those two blue pipes over there or right there. But then because there are so many different gadgets and machines in here, there's some spots where you don't have much room. Just do what you can in those spots. So a mix.
Okay. The clips go in the front.
So generally it's better to spread out acoustic materials. I've watched this video already and I think they mention that later on. But the reason is that acoustic panels not only have a front, but they also have sides, obviously, and those sides are surface area that can absorb sound. When you butt two panels up next to each other, you're basically removing that open surface area and you're reducing the overall amount of absorption that panel can do. So it's good to spread them out. If you watch some of my older videos that I've done in my old studio, you'll see a bunch of RLX panels on the back wall, mostly decorative, but they do a little bit of absorption. But you'll notice that none of them have edges touching. That increases the total amount of absorptive area, which improves their performance. So spreading them out is good, and you don't generally want edges touching. Yes, it is pretty, and you do get those cool geometric shapes, but it does reduce the overall effectiveness of the panels.
Does Elgato intend for these to go on the ceiling?
I think this is outside their scope.
So yeah, you generally do want to treat your ceiling. Generally, a ceiling is the largest single untreated surface in a room. Most studios will go for a big, expensive, fancy ceiling cloud, and then they'll leave the floor just flat hardwood or concrete or whatever. The reason is that generally floor reflections are more useful to us. If you think about it, whenever we're standing, we're always the same distance from the floor. But the ceiling could be any height, so we're not always the same distance from the ceiling. So a lot of information about how far away sounds are, we get from floor reflections. So generally carpeted floors are not a good idea in studio spaces. Generally, the approach is to go for a flat, reflective floor and then put absorption on the ceiling. But that's mostly for high-end studios, and that's not always applicable to your everyday home studio.
Now, obviously, before we roll out a bunch of these next to something like a welding station, we want to make sure they have at least some level of fire resistance. Let's see if I can actually...
There you go.
Okay.
We have a fire extinguisher, don't worry.
It's right there.
That's a lot of heat.
Okay.
Wow.
I'm convinced. Should be fine. This was one we cut up for a different deployment over on the podcast set, so it's a sacrificial one. Oh, it stinks.
But yeah.
What could go?
Okay, so I've talked about fire rating and acoustic materials before. Very important. Generally, the issue with acoustic foam is not that it burns, it's that it smolders. So when it gets hot, it melts, it releases a ton of smoke, it releases a ton of really nasty chemicals, and that's generally more of an issue than it actually burning. So, I guess welding sparks aren't going to land on it and light it on fire, but just because it doesn't actively burn doesn't mean it's not a fire hazard. It can still be a fire hazard based on the amount of smoke and bad chemicals it releases as it gets hot.
Everything we've got up here so far is still cheaper than, this kit from RLX. $660 for honestly, I'd be surprised.
So RLX, probably not the best brand as far as acoustic materials go. But like I said, I have RLX panels in my room. But this kit, for example, has a bunch of bass traps in it. They're not really bass traps, but it's those edge absorbers that are designed to go in a corner. You don't need those. They're advertised as, again, bass traps, but they're not thick enough to really work as bass traps. And it's just a ton of material that you're spending a lot of money on that's really not useful. So I wouldn't buy that kit. And also, if you're just recording your own voice, you don't really need bass treatment either, because an average speaking voice doesn't go low enough to run into bass issues. So yes, this kit is very expensive. It's also kind of a waste of money. But if you buy just regular wall panels, they're not outrageously expensive. Kit of 12 RLX panels is $100. So it's fairly similarly priced to these Elgato panels.
Honestly, I'd be surprised if that single foam type one even performs as well as this. We'll see. They're thicker though, I think.
Not really.
Fair enough. You know what, guys? We've got 19 more panels to put up, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm already noticing a
So you can look at the RLX panel and determine how well it performs.
Now, I'm just gonna come around here and we're gonna do a second sweep. Okay, approximately 5% coverage and start. We retested last time, I moved away, so.
Yeah, where you stand is actually pretty important because your body is a big fat absorber, unless you're naked, but we won't worry about that. So generally, it's important to stand in the same place. And actually, for example, Dolby has guides for how to calibrate surround sound systems. And their guides, they actually specify how you should stand when you're doing measurements to ensure that it's consistent and that all systems are calibrated equally. So where you stand, you're a big absorber of sound if you're wearing clothes, and also you can block a lot of sound. So it's important to be conscious of where you're standing when you take measurements.
Whoa! Dang! That's actually, I mean, it's not that I can't hear the difference. I can totally hear the difference. I believe it. But still, that's really impressive. 5% coverage with these things, and we went from a peak of 0.9 seconds at sort of around the range of my speaking voice, all the way to about 0.6 and change. I mean, you can tell.
Yeah, that's definitely a good result. Yeah, you don't need an outrageous amount of material to acoustically treat a room. Again, there are guides and data that can tell you what range your room should be in. The upside of this data is that the decay time is pretty even across the frequency range with these panels. That suggests these panels are pretty neutral in the ranges that they absorb sound. You can see they're not really doing anything for the lower frequencies, but you don't really need that for just spoken word. So based on that, these panels look decent, but again, I still wouldn't recommend them because you can't actually look at their performance data online before you buy them.
You can tell Elgato clearly targeted human speech frequencies because that's what this product is designed for, because that's where we see the biggest improvement, right in that 400 to approximately 1500 hertz range.
So the human voice is kind of weird because it's kind of broken up into two parts. You have your vowel sounds, like your ooh, ah, a sounds. Those are the very low pitch sounds, the lowest pitch sounds of your voice, and those, depending on the pitch of your voice, tend to sit around 1 to 200 hertz. However, your voice also has a lot of consonant sounds, so your s, ts, p, k sounds. And those sounds are a lot higher frequency. They tend to focus more in the 2 to 8 kilohertz range. So those consonants are what contributes most to intelligibility, being able to understand speech. So generally, the 2 to 8 kilohertz-ish range is the most important range for speech. And those lower frequencies are important, but not as important. However, that said, reducing the reverberation time will almost always give you a flatter response. So it's not so much that these panels are absorbing more in those middle ranges. It's more that just they're absorbing everything, and that's improving the overall tone of the room. So they're not necessarily absorbing more in those middle ranges. Again, we can't know that for sure, but generally just putting up more absorption, as assuming that the absorption is fairly flat, will kind of flatten out the room regardless.
Even up to around 3 kilohertz, it's like pretty darn good. Like, how does it sound better to you? If I'm hosting a video, okay, David, we're building this computer. We added another 6 boxes, giving us approximately 5.9% coverage, and let's go ahead and start it. You guys ready? Wow! Big improvement again, check this out, guys. We just shaved off another anywhere.
So yeah, you can see there's diminishing returns as you add more material. It looks like they're in the neighborhood of about 0.5 to 0.6 second decay time, which is probably pretty close to the target range for their room size, maybe slightly lower, but you know, Lower isn't always better, but in this case, it's probably not bad. You can also see the frequency response is a little less even. So personally, I might stick with the 5% coverage, but you know, if you've got the material, you basically might as well use it.
Anywhere from 0.1 to 0.2 of a second in the range that we care about, which is kind of in here. This is honestly way better than I expected.
Yeah, the range that Linus is looking at is definitely lower than the range I would be worried about for speech. You can also see low frequencies aren't really affected. Not surprising, but also not super worrisome unless Linus decides he wants to start recording music in this space.
Like, this is completely usable now. We could keep putting on panels, but honestly, I just don't really feel like it's necessary. We can take these panels, we can treat other areas in the studio. You know what? You guys might look at the cost of this, $2,100, and you might think, whoa, that's a lot of money, and it is. But compared to what normal acoustic treatment panels cost from specialty vendors, they are darn freaking reasonable. Remember, this is a big room. Now, obviously, you could save a lot of money doing it yourself with rock wool or ultra touch batting and a wooden frame. Absolutely. But considering the overall package here, I think Corsair's got...
Yeah, I've built my own panels, but I also have panels that I purchased. The cost can depend a lot based on what's available in your area, and like right now the cost of lumber is outrageous, and that would really push up the cost of materials if you're going to build wood paneled or wood framed panels. Acoustic treatment is hard, and honestly, you have the option of buying something like RLX or GIK acoustic panels. They're pretty reasonable price. Don't bother with their bass traps. Just buy wall panels. You can build your own panels with rock wool. Again, totally reasonable thing to do. Another thing is buying curtains. Curtains are actually really good acoustic absorbers, and putting up curtains. Just buying like cheap, lightweight curtains won't really do anything, but anything with like a fairly dense, heavy weave, either curtains or drapery, is a really good absorber. A lot of good information in this video, a lot of good information on testing, but overall, the product that they're advertising, it's just, I don't think it's a good investment. Anyway, that's it for this video. Long one, first one I've done in this style, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and if so, let me know with that like button. If not, hit the dislike button. Let me know if you have any questions or thoughts down in the comments down below, and if you want to see more videos on sound and acoustics and mixing and all sorts of stuff, definitely hit that subscribe button.